The German Shepherd wouldn't move. That was the first thing Lucas noticed. Shadow, a dog that had cleared buildings in Fallujah and never once disobeyed a command, standing rigid at the door of a broken-down RV in the middle of a Montana blizzard, refusing to come when called. An old man was behind that door, white-haired, laughing too easily, asking for one night's shelter like it cost him nothing. Lucas didn't know yet about the medication, the hidden pill case, the medical file folded into thirds at the bottom of a duffel bag. He didn't know a 15-year-old promise was about to drag itself back to his door. He almost turned them away. Shadow wouldn't let him. If this kind of story reaches something in you, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's begin. The storm came without ceremony. 1 hour, the sky above Redstone Valley was the flat, colorless gray of old concrete, the kind of ceiling that sat low over the mountains and pressed down on everything beneath it. The next hour it opened. Not gradually, violently, the way weather moved in that part of Montana when it finally decided to commit. Snow drove sideways across the highway, packed itself into the fence lines, and reduced visibility to 40 feet in less than 20 minutes. Lucas Grant had watched it coming from the barn. He'd been out there since 4 in the afternoon, finishing a repair on the south stall gate that had been warped since October and finally gave out in the overnight freeze. He worked without gloves because gloves made the wrench slip, and he'd learned a long time ago that comfort was a poor trade for precision. His knuckles were red raw by the time he finished. He stood up, tested the latch twice, and looked west at the wall of weather moving toward him across the flats. Shadow sat 3 feet away, watching the same sky. "Yeah," Lucas said. The dog didn't look at him. They walked back to the house together, Lucas with his toolbox, Shadow matching his pace exactly the way he always did, neither ahead nor behind, just alongside. It was a habit from the dog's working years that had never fully dissolved into retirement. Shadow had been trained by the Marines as a multi-purpose K9, explosives detection, patrol, building clearance, and 7 years of operational conditioning didn't disappear just because the paperwork said retired. The dog still moved like he was reading a grid, still slept facing the door. Lucas had adopted him 4 years ago when Shadow's handler, a corporal named Dietz, took a contract overseas and the Corps couldn't place the dog elsewhere. The rescue coordinator had warned Lucas that Shadow was a lot of dog for a quiet life. She wasn't wrong, but quiet life was relative. Lucas's version of quiet included a 40-acre horse ranch with 2 difficult mares, a fence line that needed constant maintenance, ground that froze solid from November through March, and a 12-mile stretch of highway between his gate and the nearest gas station. Quiet was the absence of other people, mostly. That was the part he'd chosen deliberately. He got inside, knocked the snow off his boots on the porch, and started the wood stove while Shadow drank from his bowl in the kitchen. The ranch house was large for one person, 4 bedrooms, built in the 1960s by a rancher with optimistic ideas about family. Lucas had bought it 7 years ago for less than a used pickup truck because the roof needed work. The plumbing was original, and no one else wanted property that isolated. He'd fixed the roof himself over 2 summers. The plumbing he'd mostly negotiated with. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the storm intensify. The highway was invisible now. That was fine. Nobody came down that road in weather like this, and the few people who lived nearby knew better than to travel it. Lucas's nearest neighbor was a woman named Edna Kaspar, who kept goats on 3 acres about 6 miles east. She'd brought him a pie once when he first moved in, welcomed him to the valley, and had largely left him alone since, which was the precise reason he'd brought the pie plate back the same afternoon with a note that said, "Thank you." He respected people who understood unspoken agreements. He took his coffee to the front room and sat. Shadow lay down near the wood stove, curled once, and went still. Lucas opened a book he'd been reading for 3 weeks without advancing more than 40 pages. He read the same paragraph twice and gave up on it, set it down, watched the fire through the iron grate. He was not a man who talked to himself, which meant the silence in the house was simply silence. Not the kind that felt like something missing, just the kind that existed. He'd made peace with it, mostly. At 8:47 p.m., the headlights appeared. He saw them through the front window, twin beams sweeping across his fence line from the highway, moving too slowly and at the wrong angle. Then they stopped. Then they moved again, wrong angle again, like someone steering through deep snow and losing the line. Then they stopped for good. Shadow's head came up off his paws. Lucas watched the light sit motionless for 2 minutes. Nobody pulled over on that stretch of highway in a blizzard unless something had gone wrong. There was nothing out here to stop for. No turnout, no landmark, no reason. He set down his coffee, put on his coat and boots by the door, took a flashlight from the hook. "Stay," he said to Shadow. He went out into the storm. The wind hit him before he cleared the porch, a hard lateral push that carried ice crystals and enough force to make him lean into it. He crossed the yard to the gate with his head down, flashlight cutting maybe 15 feet through the blowing snow. The temperature had dropped since he came in from the barn. He guessed it was somewhere below 5 now, not counting the wind. His breath came in tight plumes that vanished immediately. The gate was padlocked. He unlocked it and pushed through. The RV was parked half off the shoulder of the highway, its rear end canted slightly into the snow-filled ditch, hazard lights flashing amber through the storm. It was older, mid-2000s, a Class C motorhome with a cab-over sleeping area and a body that had clearly logged serious miles. One of the rear tires was sunk to the axle in drifted snow. The engine was running, exhaust visible from the tailpipe, which meant it hadn't died completely, but it wasn't going anywhere either. Lucas knocked on the driver's side door with his flashlight handle. A moment later, the window slid down. An old man looked out at him. White-haired, pink-faced from the cold inside what was apparently a poorly heated cab, eyes bright and slightly startled but not panicked. Somewhere in his mid-70s. Heavy canvas shirt, no jacket on. "Well," the old man said, "I was starting to think nobody lived out here." "Nobody much does," Lucas said. "What happened?" "Drove into a drift I couldn't see and got myself stuck." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reporting a minor inconvenience. "Rear wheel's buried. I've got a tow strap, but no one to pull me. I've got a truck." "I figured you might, being as you've got a ranch gate right there." The old man smiled. It was an easy smile, reflexive, the kind that came from a lifetime of smoothing over difficult moments. "Arthur Collins. The one fretting in the back is my wife, Margaret." A voice came from behind him, slightly muffled. "I am not fretting, I am being reasonably concerned." "She's fretting," Arthur said to Lucas privately. Lucas looked past him at the RV, then back at the storm. Getting the vehicle out of the ditch tonight would take time, and by the time they cleared it, conditions would be worse. The highway wasn't plowed. Probably wouldn't be until morning. "You're not going anywhere tonight?" Lucas said. "I was afraid of that. I can pull you onto the shoulder properly and you can run the heat in there until it clears. Or—" He stopped. "Or?" Arthur said. Lucas looked at him. The old man's lips were slightly blue at the corners. The cab behind him wasn't warm. Lucas could see vapor from Margaret's breath in the background. He didn't finish the sentence. He'd been about to offer the barn maybe, which was at least insulated. But something else was working in him, something he hadn't decided to engage. "Give me 10 minutes, Lucas said. He went back to the truck. What happened next was simply mechanical. Lucas backed the truck to the gate, ran the tow strap under the RV's rear frame, and used 4-wheel drive and controlled engine braking to rock the stuck wheel free. It took 11 minutes. The RV came clear of the ditch, and he guided Arthur to pull it through the gate and park on the flat gravel apron near the barn, out of the wind line, where the fencing gave some shelter from the northwest. He coiled the tow strap and hung it on the fence. He had fully intended to tell them good night at that point, that they were welcome to stay on the property until morning, that he had coffee if they needed it, that there was a spigot on the barn's east wall that wouldn't freeze if they needed water. That was his plan. Shadow had come out to the yard when Lucas drove back through the gate, and now the dog was sitting at the RV's entry door. Not pacing, not alert in the patrol sense, just sitting, like he'd been called there. Lucas watched him for a moment. "Shadow, here." The dog didn't move. "Shadow." Nothing. The dog sat precisely where he was, oriented toward the RV door, still as carved stone. In 7 years of working alongside a military K-9 and 4 years of living with one, Lucas had never once seen Shadow disobey a direct command. The dog had flaws. He was territorial. He didn't like strangers on the property. He needed work or he got restless. But disobedience wasn't one of them. His obedience was structural, built into him at a level below conscious choice. Except right now. Lucas walked over, He crouched next to the dog and looked at the door, then looked at Shadow. The dog's ears were relaxed. His body wasn't tense. There was nothing threatening in his posture at all. No alerting, no hackles, no watchfulness. I was just there, like he'd decided to be there, like the place made sense to him. "What is it? Lucas said quietly. The RV door opened. Margaret Collins appeared at the top of the entry steps. A small woman, mid-70s, white hair cut short and practical, wearing a heavy cardigan and looking at Shadow with an expression that was equal parts surprised and delighted. "Oh," she said. "Hello there." Shadow's tail moved, once, slow, like a flag in a light wind. Lucas stood up. He looked at the Collins woman, then at the storm driving across the yard, then back at Shadow, who still hadn't moved. He breathed in through his nose, held it, let it go. "There's a spare bedroom," he said. It came out flat, almost reluctant. "Two, actually. Heatworks, bathrooms down the hall." He paused. "Just for tonight." Margaret Collins looked at him with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly, more like recognition, like she'd been expecting something difficult to become simple and had simply waited for it. "That is very kind," she said. "It's practical," Lucas said. "I don't want to deal with a medical emergency on my property at 2 a.m. "That's also kind," she said, just worded differently. He picked up Shadow's collar and held it, not pulling, just maintaining the contact, and walked toward the house. Shadow came with him this time, and as they went, the dog looked back once toward the RV door. Lucas didn't. The house was warm. He'd let the wood stove build while he was outside, and the front room held the heat well. He showed the Collinses the bedroom, the one on the south side with the better mattress, the one he used when he had guests, which was rare, and told them where the bathroom was, where the towels were, where the kitchen was if they needed water. Arthur moved through the house with a slight deliberateness that Lucas registered without naming. Not slow, exactly. More like careful. He touched the door frame when he walked through it, a steadying gesture so quick it might not have been intentional. He stood straight, and his voice was full, and his eyes were sharp, but there was something calibrated about how he moved. Lucas had seen that calibration before. His first sergeant in the Corps had moved the same way in his last year before retirement, managing something, parceling out exertion, keeping the cost of every motion below a certain threshold where it would become visible. He didn't comment on it. Margaret went to the kitchen immediately and began looking at things with the specific attention of a woman assessing a working space. "Do you mind if I make us all tea?" she said. "There's coffee," Lucas said. "I know, I saw it. But tea's better for a cold night." She paused. "If you have it." Cabinet above the stove, left side. She turned to look at him over her shoulder, and there was something in the look that he couldn't categorize. Gratitude, certainly, but beneath that something more layered, like she was seeing him and seeing something else at the same time, something that had nothing to do with this kitchen. "Thank you," she said, simple and complete. Arthur settled at the kitchen table with the ease of a man who had been a guest in many kitchens and knew how to make himself comfortable without being presumptuous. He set his hands flat on the table and looked around the room. The mounted topographic map on the wall, the row of hooks by the door with gear hanging neatly from them, the wood stove in the next room visible through the open doorway. "Horse ranch?" he said. "Yeah." "How many head?" "2 mares right now. Had more, but I sold down when the winter maintenance got ahead of me." Arthur nodded, like that made practical sense. "What kind?" "Quarter horses. Good working stock." "When they feel like it," Lucas said. Arthur smiled at that. "Sounds like a few people I've known." Shadow had settled himself in the corner of the kitchen near the baseboards, watching Arthur with the same quiet attention he'd shown at the RV. Not protective, not evaluating, just watching, the way dogs sometimes watched people they'd decided were interesting. Arthur noticed. "He come with the ranch?" "No, adopted him from the Corps. He was a working dog." "I can tell." Arthur studied the dog for a moment. "You got any deployments on him?" Lucas looked at him. 2. Helmand Province, then Ramadi. "What was his rate? Was he a patrol dog or detection?" "Both. He cross-trained. They used him for route clearance in his first tour and building work in his second." Arthur nodded slowly, still looking at the dog. "Animals that have done that kind of work, they know things. I don't mean trained things. I mean things they picked up that nobody taught them on purpose. He paused. My father had a horse that could tell which men on his crew were carrying trouble before they ever opened their mouths. Took my father 20 years to stop dismissing it. Lucas didn't respond to that, but he didn't dismiss it either. Margaret set 3 cups of tea on the table and sat down. The storm howled against the window above the sink, and the wood stove ticked and popped in the other room, and the 3 of them sat in a kitchen in a snowstorm in Montana, with cups of tea going warm in their hands. And for a while nobody said anything, and the silence was the kind that didn't need filling. So, they talked, eventually. Not about anything urgent. Arthur had been a mechanical engineer, 34 years with an industrial firm in Iowa. The kind of work that meant he could look at a broken piece of equipment and understand what had failed and why. Margaret had taught elementary school for 26 years. They'd lived in the same house in Dubuque their entire married life. 48 years in the same house, same street, same neighbors. We kept saying we'd do the trip, Margaret said. She was holding her cup in both hands. Every year, the kids grew up, the grandkids came, there was always something. What changed? Lucas said. She glanced at Arthur, a quick look, not long. We ran out of reasons not to, Arthur said. It was the right answer. It was also not the complete answer, and Lucas, who had interrogated people professionally for 4 years as an intelligence sergeant, knew the difference. But he didn't press it. People were allowed their versions of things. Where are you headed? He said. Everywhere, Margaret said, and she meant it completely. We've got a list, Arthur said. Not destinations exactly. More like things. Glacier. The Pacific Coast. Big Sur. We've never seen the Pacific Ocean. You're headed the wrong direction for Big Sur, Lucas said. We know. We're going to Glacier first, then looping south and west. In December. We're aware of the timing, Arthur said, dry. Glacier is closed in December. We know, he smiled. We thought we'd look at it from the outside. Margaret wants to see it in the snow. I've always wanted to see it in the snow, Margaret confirmed. Lucas looked at them across the table. 2 people in their mid-70s planning to drive a Class C RV through Montana in December to look at a closed national park in the snow, then loop south to the Pacific Coast. The vehicle had already put itself in a ditch on a clear stretch of highway. He thought several things he didn't say. Shadow shifted in the corner, resettled, and went quiet again. They turned in around 10:30. Lucas showed them where the extra blankets were, the hall closet, top shelf, and told them the lock on the bathroom door sometimes needed a second turn to catch. They thanked him with the uncomplicated ease of people who knew how to receive hospitality without making it heavy. Lucas sat by the wood stove for an hour after they went down the hall. He read 2 pages of his book and didn't retain either of them. Shadow lay with his head on Lucas's foot, which he only did when he decided it was time for them both to be still. The storm worked its way through the house, trying the windows, pressing on the walls. The fire settled into coals. Lucas was not the man who entertained much. He'd chosen this land and this isolation with intention, and he'd maintained it the same way, deliberately, without apology. He didn't dislike people. He had simply found that people at a distance were easier to manage than people nearby, because nearby meant obligations, and obligations meant failure was personal. He had failed, personally, once. It had cost him more than he'd ever told anyone. He stoked the fire once more, just enough to carry through the night, and went to bed. He woke at 2:14 a.m. not from a sound, or rather, from the absence of the right sounds and the presence of a wrong one. The wind was still there, the house was still settling, but underneath all of it was a different kind of quiet that his body recognized before his brain caught up. He lay still for 3 seconds, cataloging. Then he heard the RV door. Outside, through the storm, muffled but distinguishable. The click of the RV's entry door, then footsteps on snow. Then nothing. Lucas got up. He didn't turn on a light. He crossed to the front window in the dark and looked out toward the barn. The motion-sensing light on the barn's exterior had tripped. In its white halogen wash, Lucas could see Arthur Collins standing beside the RV in the snow, in his coat and boots, with his back partly toward the house. He had something in his hand. He was doing something deliberate and careful with it, and his posture was the posture of someone who wanted to be outside and alone. Lucas watched. Arthur opened his hand and looked at what was in his palm. Then he tilted his head back. It wasn't looking at the sky. The sky was invisible behind the storm. It was more like the gesture a man made when he was swallowing something and didn't want to feel the going down. He took the medication, closed his fist around the empty pill case, stood there in the snow for another 30 seconds, head level now, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned and went back inside the RV. The motion light timed out. The yard went dark. Lucas stood at the window for a while longer. Shadow had come to stand beside him, silent. The dog's nose was near the glass, breath fogging it in a small circle. Lucas didn't move. There was a difference between a man who went outside in a blizzard at 2 in the morning to take his medication privately and a man who simply forgot to take it indoors. The difference was intent. The difference was that Arthur Collins, who moved with careful precision through other people's kitchens and laughed too easily at his own inconveniences and had smiled at Lucas's gait like the whole situation was a minor comedy. Arthur Collins was managing something he didn't want his wife to see him manage. And Lucas, who had spent years reading the things people didn't say, stood in the dark of his own house and understood that whatever was parked outside his gate wasn't just a broken RV and an old couple on a late road trip. The storm pressing at his windows wasn't the most serious thing on this property tonight. I went back to bed. That was the decision he made, standing in the dark with Shadow beside him and the barn light gone out and the storm working steadily at every seam in the house. He turned from the window, crossed back to his bedroom, and lay down on top of the covers with his boots still on, which was a habit from 15 years ago that he'd never completely shed. He did not sleep. He lay there and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around him, and at some point around 4 in the morning the wind shifted and the snow stopped driving horizontally and started falling in the more ordinary vertical way, and eventually something in his chest unclenched enough for his eyes to close. He was up at 6. The storm had dropped 14 inches overnight. Lucas knew before he opened the door because the light coming through the east window had that particular white quality, reflected and amplified, the whole landscape acting as a mirror. He dressed, fed Shadow, put on his coat, and went out to check the horses before anything else. The 2 mares, Cora and Belle, were in the south stall where he'd left them, irritable and impatient in the way horses got when weather kept them confined. He fed them, broke the ice crust on their water trough with a hammer, and checked their hooves for packed snow. Cora tried to bite him when he bent to her left rear foot, which was her consistent position on the matter. He put a hand flat on her flank and said a word, and she shifted but stopped trying. When he came out of the barn, Arthur Collins was standing in the yard. He was dressed in work clothes, canvas pants, a heavy flannel shirt, work boots that looked like they'd seen genuine use. And he was looking at the fence line along the north side of the property where several posts had heeled over in the storm, pulling the wire loose. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and his breath was rising in the cold air, and he was studying the fence with the focused attention of someone forming a plan. "Morning," Lucas said. Arthur turned. "Morning. Your north line's down in 3 places." "I can see that. I can help you reset those posts if you've got a driver." Lucas looked at him. The careful movement from the night before was still present, not pronounced, not dramatic, but there if you were watching for it. Arthur's left hand came out of his pocket, and he turned it slightly, working the fingers once before putting it back. "I've got a driver," Lucas said. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. I'd like to." He said it plainly, without loading it with significance. Just a man who wanted to be useful. "I've been driving for 3 days straight, and my back is telling me about it. Working a fence line sounds better than sitting in that RV watching Margaret reorganize the cabinets." From inside the RV, visible through the small window above the kitchenette, Margaret's silhouette moved with purpose. "She does that," Arthur said. "Don't take it personally." Lucas considered him for a moment. "Coffee first," he said. "That's a reasonable policy." Margaret had already located the coffee in his kitchen and made it, which he discovered when he came inside. She'd also found the cast iron pan and made eggs, which were sitting covered on the back burner. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book, a paperback thriller with a broken spine and dog-eared pages that had clearly been read more than once. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not looking up from the page. The eggs were going to turn if somebody didn't use them. Lucas looked at the pan. He'd had those eggs for 11 days. "They were fine," he said. "They were on the edge," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She got up without being asked, filled a plate, and set it in front of him with a fork and a paper napkin folded into a rough triangle. Then she sat back down with her book. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed, turning a page. He ate. Shadow positioned himself near Lucas's chair and monitored the plate with professional detachment. Margaret, without looking up from her book, slid a small piece of egg off the edge of her own plate and set it on the floor. Shadow took it quietly. "He doesn't beg," Lucas said. "I know." He waited to be offered. She glanced at the dog over the top of the book. "Good manners." Arthur came in stamping snow off his boots and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and they ate together in the particular comfortable silence of people who had nothing to prove to each other yet, which was different from the loaded silence of strangers. It was almost domestic, which was not a word Lucas would have chosen for anything in his life, and which he observed now with a neutrality he wasn't sure he felt. They fixed the fence. It took most of the morning. 3 posts had heeled over and 1 had snapped at the base, which meant digging out the stump and setting a new post, which was harder work in frozen ground. Lucas ran the post driver, a manual model, a weighted steel tube you lifted and dropped repeatedly over the post head, and Arthur worked the wire, pulling tension and stapling it to the reset posts with the efficiency of someone who had done similar work before. "You do much of this growing up?" Lucas said, between drops of the driver. "My grandfather had a farm outside Waterloo. I spent summers there from the time I was 8 until I was 16. "Iowa?" "Iowa. Corn and soybeans mostly, but he ran a small cattle operation on the side, 60 head. My job for 3 summers was fence maintenance." Arthur pulled a length of wire taut and held it while he reached for the staple gun. "I hated it then. Learned everything about it anyway." "Funny how that works? The things you hate learning are usually the ones you keep." Lucas dropped the driver. The post sank another 1.5 inches into the frozen ground. He lifted and dropped again. "How long are you planning to stay?" It came out more direct than he'd intended. Not hostile, but close. Arthur didn't take offense. He stapled the wire, checked the tension, moved down to the next post. "Until the road's passable. I'm not going to take that RV onto an unplowed highway." He paused. "A day. Maybe 2. The county doesn't always plow that stretch until day 3 after a storm. Then 3 days. Lucas lifted the driver. "I'm not complaining," he said, which was partially true. Arthur glanced at him. "You live alone out here by choice." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It occupied the uncertain space between them. An observation extended slightly in the direction of conversation, waiting to see what happened. "Yes," Lucas said. "Most people who choose that, there's a specific reason." "Most people have specific reasons for most things." Arthur nodded slowly, working the wire. "That's fair." They didn't talk much after that, but the silence was different from the mornings, but it had weight in it now, some mutual acknowledgement that they'd come close to something, and agreed, without discussion, to leave it where it was. Lucas respected that. He respected people who could hold a line without making it a wall. Shadow worked the perimeter of the fence line while they set posts, trotting back and forth through the knee-high snow with his nose at ground level, cataloging whatever the storm had moved around in the night. At one point, he disappeared into the tree line for 6 minutes and came back with dried blood on his muzzle from something he'd found and investigated. Lucas cleaned it with a rag from his coat pocket and didn't ask questions. The dog's business was his own. By noon, the fence was repaired. Not perfectly. The new post would need to be checked in the spring thaw, and 2 of the wire tensions were marginally loose, but functional. Weather solid, which was what mattered. They walked back to the house in the cold white silence of post-storm Montana, and Lucas was aware, in some practical and not particularly comfortable way, that he hadn't spent a working morning in another person's company in longer than he could accurately place. The days accumulated, not through planning, through weather. The county didn't plow the highway access road until day 4, and when they did, they opened 1 lane of the highway itself, but left the turnoff to Lucas's gate buried under 2 feet of packed snow from the plow pass. By day 5, a secondary system moved through and dropped another 8 inches. By the end of the first week, the RV had settled into its spot on the gravel apron like it intended to be there. Lucas did not extend a formal invitation for them to stay. He also did not tell them to leave. This was the kind of decision he made by not making it, which he was aware was a form of cowardice dressed as practicality. He told himself it was because the road was impassable, which was true, and because turning people out in those conditions was unreasonable, which was also true. And he didn't examine what else might be true. Margaret cooked dinner twice in the first week without being asked and set 3 places at the table without comment. Lucas ate what she made and said thank you and washed the dishes himself because it was his kitchen, and she let him, which maintained a balance they'd apparently agreed on without discussing it. Arthur worked. That was the part that surprised Lucas. Not that Arthur offered to help, but the quality of what he did. The man understood machinery at a structural level. He found the tractor's hydraulic issue that Lucas had been chasing for 6 weeks, a slow leak in the return line that only showed up under sustained load, diagnosed it by listening and by feel, and fixed it with parts from a box of spares in the corner of the barn that Lucas hadn't gone through because he didn't know what was in it. "Where'd you learn hydraulics?" Lucas asked, watching him work. "Engineering degree, 34 years of equipment maintenance, and 1 very expensive lesson with the cherry picker in 1987 that I would prefer not to discuss." Arthur tightened the line fitting with a wrench, wiped his hands on a shop rag. "How long has that been leaking?" 2 months, at least." "You lose much fluid?" "Enough that I've been nursing it." "You'll want to run the circuit a few times and check the fitting under load. Might need a second tightening." He looked at the tractor with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had returned a thing to its correct state. "Good machine, though. These older Deeres are tanks." Lucas looked at the repaired line, and then at the man, and something shifted slightly in how he was framing Arthur Collins, from guest, which implied temporary and peripheral, towards something without a clean word attached to it. He didn't say any of this. He said, "You want coffee?" "I want coffee," Arthur said. Shadow's behavior remained the thing Lucas returned to when he was trying to understand what was happening in his own house. The dog had a clear and established relationship with people on the property. Tolerant of Lucas, wary of strangers, hostile to anyone who moved wrong or pushed past his boundary without invitation. In the 4 years since Lucas had adopted him, Shadow had bitten 1 person, a county assessor who'd come out unannounced and tried to pet him without asking. The assessor had not required stitches. Shadow had not apologized. With Arthur and Margaret, the dog behaved like someone had thrown out the manual. He followed Margaret through the kitchen when she cooked, positioning himself near enough to be underfoot but not actually in the way. When she sat, he lay down near her feet. Not for scraps. He did this when she wasn't eating, when she was reading, when she was sitting with her hands folded looking out the window at the snow. He just stayed close. Margaret, for her part, spoke to him in a low continuous murmur when they were alone, that Lucas caught fragments of once or twice. Nothing specific, just the kind of running quiet narration that certain people used with animals and children, a reassurance that something attentive was present. With Arthur, Shadow was different. He didn't follow him. He watched him. It was the specific watching that Lucas recognized from the dog's working years, the sustained, non-reactive attention of an animal that had been trained to observe and assess. When Arthur was in a room, Shadow faced him, not guarding, not alerting, evaluating, continuously, with the patience of something that had decided it needed to understand a particular subject completely. Lucas had seen Shadow watch a building the same way before they sent teams in. He didn't know what to do with that, so he watched them both and said nothing, and kept his own assessment running in the background where it had been running since the first night. The medical file was in the tote bag. He didn't go looking for it. He wasn't built that way. He'd spent enough years in intelligence work to know that information extracted without permission was always more complicated than information offered willingly, and he'd made himself a general policy of not pursuing what people chose to protect. It was the most he could do with what the job had turned him into. But the tote bag fell off the bench in the spare bedroom. He heard it go while he was in the hall, and when he came to the doorway, he could see the contents spread across the floor, and Margaret was in the barn with Shadow, and the document at the top of the scattered pile was a hospital letterhead he recognized from the town where he bought his farming supplies, a cardiology department letterhead, and the name at the top of the page was Arthur James Collins. He stood in the doorway for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he walked past without entering, continued down the hall, and went outside to help Margaret carry the fresh water back from the spigot, which she didn't need help with but accepted without comment. He spent the afternoon splitting firewood in the side yard, more than he needed, working until his shoulders burned because the physical load gave him something specific to attend to. That wasn't the letterhead and the name on it, and the institutional language he'd processed in 4 seconds that his brain had already rendered into plain English without being asked to. At dinner, Arthur and Margaret talked about Iowa, about their daughter, who lived in Portland now, and sent them photos of their grandchildren, about a dog they'd had for 14 years named Chester, who had died the previous spring and whose absence was still present in the way they sometimes paused before mentioning something that Chester would have done in a given situation. He used to steal the mittens out of the mudroom, Margaret said. Not chew them, just collect them. We'd find them in his bed, one from each pair so they were all useless. Arthur laughed, and it was a full laugh, nothing managed about it. He had a system. We just never figured out what the system was. Lucas listened. He ate. He said little. He watched Arthur reach for his water glass and noticed the slight tremor in his hand. Too controlled to be visible in normal light, but the lamp was at the right angle tonight, and the water moved in the glass before he got it steadily to his mouth. Arthur set the glass down and continued talking, and Lucas looked at his own plate. Shadow was on the far side of the room, watching Arthur. His ears were forward. He confronted him on a Tuesday. That was 10 days in. The highway was plowed and passable. The sun had come out for 2 consecutive days, and the driveway was clear enough for the RV to exit. There was no physical reason for the Collinses to still be at the ranch, which meant they were staying because he'd continued not to tell them otherwise. And he woke up on Tuesday morning and understood that he had to make a decision about what this was, because letting it accumulate without decision was its own kind of decision, and he'd never been comfortable making choices by erosion. He found Arthur in the barn after breakfast. The man was looking at Cora, not touching her, just standing near the stall gate and watching her with his hands loose at his sides, and Cora, who disliked almost everyone, was watching him back with her ears at a neutral angle, which was as close to acceptance as she got. "Road's been clear since yesterday," Lucas said. "I know. You've got good weather for the next 3 days, window for the drive north." "I know that too." Lucas stood next to him and looked at the horse. She flicked an ear and went back to her hay. "I'm not asking you to go," he said. "I want to be straight about that. But you're not asking us to stay either." "No." Arthur was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in the measured tone of a man who had thought about what he was going to say before he needed to say it, which told Lucas this conversation had been expected. "I had an episode in the fall," Arthur said. "October. Ended up in the hospital for 6 days." He didn't look at Lucas. He was watching Cora. "They made some adjustments to my medications. Told me the situation was managed. That's the word my cardiologist used. Managed. That's not the same as okay," Lucas said. "No, it's not." "How long have you known?" Arthur exhaled slowly through his nose. "End-stage diagnosis came in August. But I've known something was wrong for longer than that. A year, maybe. You know your own body well enough, eventually." Lucas was quiet. He'd asked the question directly because it was the only way he knew how to ask things, and he'd gotten a direct answer, which told him something about the man. "Margaret knows," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "She knows some of it, not the full timeline." He finally turned to look at Lucas, and his eyes were steady. Not defiant, not asking for pity, just open. "She knows I'm sick. She doesn't know the specific terms the doctors are using." "You should tell her," Lucas said. "I know I should." "She's going to figure it out." "She already has," Arthur said quietly. "She's smarter than I've ever given her credit for, which is saying something because I've always thought she was the smartest person I know." A pause. "We're not talking about it because talking about it makes it a different kind of real. And right now, the kind of real we're in is one where we're driving across the country and seeing things we should have seen 20 years ago." Lucas looked at the hay on the barn floor. Cora huffed and shifted her weight. "We kept putting it off," Arthur said. "The trip. Every year, something. And then suddenly there's a year where you can't put it off anymore, and you're running out of years." He said it without bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of how things had arranged themselves. "That's why we left in December, before anyone could talk us out of it. Before the next appointment, the next result. Before I decided I didn't have the energy." Lucas said nothing. He had learned in a decade of operational service that there were moments when silence was the most honest response available, and this was one of them. "How long did they give you?" he said finally. Arthur's expression shifted. Not pain, exactly. more like the look of a man who had sat with a number long enough for it to become ordinary. They don't really like giving numbers, but reading between the lines of what they said and didn't say. He paused. 6 months, maybe. Could be more. Unlikely to be much more. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a raven called once from somewhere in the tree line and then went silent. "I'm sorry," Lucas said. "Don't be," Arthur said, and he meant it. "I've had a good life. The parts I didn't live, that's what I regret. Not the life itself." He reached out slowly and set his hand on the top rail of Cora's stall gate. The horse moved toward him, which was unusual enough that Lucas noted it. Arthur let her nose his palm for a moment. She didn't bite, which was unusual. And then she went back to her hay like the interaction had satisfied some need she hadn't articulated. Arthur straightened. "I'd like to stay a while longer if you'll have us," he said. "Not forever, just a while." Lucas looked at him, at the horse, at the thin light coming in through the barn's east-facing window and lying in pale strips across the floor between them. "The south room's already yours," he said. Margaret, who had not been present for any of that conversation, came out of the ranch house at noon with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper for all three of them and set them on the tailgate of Lucas's truck without announcing herself, and then went back inside to continue whatever she was doing in the kitchen. Lucas and Arthur ate their sandwiches standing at the tailgate in the winter sun, and Shadow sat between them and looked at the sandwiches with focused optimism, and nobody spoke for a while, and the valley lay white and still in every direction, and the mountains beyond it were the particular impossible blue they got in the clear, cold air after a storm. "She knows," Lucas said quietly. "I know she knows," Arthur said. "You should still tell her." Arthur took a bite of his sandwich, chewed, swallowed. "You're kind of a difficult person," he said. "I've been told that," Lucas said. Arthur looked at the mountains. "You're probably right," he said. "I know you're right." They finished their sandwiches. Shadow got the crusts. The ranch changed in ways that were hard to name and easy to observe. Margaret had a way of filling a space that wasn't about physical presence or volume. She simply made a room feel used, the way rooms in lived-in houses felt different from rooms in empty ones. She rearranged his kitchen in small ways that he noticed and didn't correct because the new arrangement was actually more efficient, which irritated him slightly and then stopped irritating him. She found a crack in the caulking around the bathroom window and repaired it with a tube she produced from somewhere in the RV, and then didn't mention it, which he only discovered when he noticed the draft was gone. Arthur kept working. He had an engineer's compulsion toward broken things. He couldn't stand to observe a malfunction without addressing it, and the ranch, which had been maintained by one person operating at the edge of his capacity, had a running list of malfunctions. The water heater pressure valve, the secondary circuit breaker that had been tripping irregularly, the binding on the barn's sliding main door that had gotten progressively worse since fall. One by one, without agenda, Arthur worked through them. Lucas watched this happen and said little. He helped when asked and didn't get in the way when not asked, which was the most he could offer and which seemed to be enough. At night they sat in the front room after dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Margaret read. Arthur had developed a habit of looking at the topographic map on the wall with extended attention, tracing routes with his eyes the way a man did when he was planning something. Lucas fed the wood stove and drank his coffee and let the evening do what evenings did. Shadow slept in the center of the room, equidistant from all three of them, which Lucas noticed but kept to himself. He was sleeping better than he had in months. He didn't examine why. He suspected if he looked directly at the reason it would become complicated, and the thing it was right now, uncomplicated, quiet, functional, was worth protecting. There was still the matter of the file, the cardiology letterhead, the language he'd read in 4 seconds and could not unread. And there was still the matter of the other thing, the older thing, the 15-year-old thing that lived in a box in the top of his closet, and that he had not opened since he moved to this valley, and that Arthur's presence had begun, for reasons he couldn't explain with any precision, to make slightly heavier every day. He went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the house. 3 people and a dog breathing in their separate rooms, the wood stove cooling, the valley outside holding its cold quiet. The weight in the closet was still there. It had been there for 15 years and he had learned to carry it without thinking about it, the way you eventually stopped feeling a scar. But lately it sat differently. No longer just weight, but pressure. The kind that builds towards something whether you intend it to or not. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes and did not sleep for a long time. The pressure built slowly, the way weather built, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. January came in hard across the valley. The temperatures dropped into the negative teens and stayed there, and the ranch contracted around the cold, the way living things do, drawing inward, conserving. Lucas's morning started earlier. Pipes needed checking. The horses needed more feed. The wood stove demanded constant attention. He moved through these routines the same way he always had, except now there were two more people moving through the house alongside him, and the house had adjusted to them the way houses adjust to occupants, unconsciously, until their absence would register as a specific kind of wrong. He didn't think about that. He had the pipes to check. Arthur had kept his word about telling Margaret. Lucas didn't know exactly when it happened. He came in from the barn one afternoon and found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and her eyes somewhere past the window. And Arthur was in the chair beside her with one hand over hers, and neither of them looked up when he came in. Lucas poured himself coffee, took it to the front room, and fed the wood stove unnecessary wood for 20 minutes until the sound of conversation resumed in the kitchen. When Margaret came to start dinner that evening, she moved the same as always. She didn't mention it. She made beef stew from a cut Lucas had in the freezer and called them both to the table and served it hot. And the conversation was about a news story Arthur had read on his phone about a rancher in Wyoming who had trained a donkey to guard sheep, and Margaret's position was that donkeys were underestimated as a species, and Lucas's position was that he'd known a few donkeys, and underestimation was the least of their problems. He watched her laugh at something Arthur said and understood. With the precision of someone who had spent years reading people in high-stakes rooms, that she had decided to carry what she'd been told in a specific way, outward-facing, present tense, deliberate. It was a form of courage he recognized. He'd seen it in officers who'd gotten bad news and still had a mission to run. He didn't say any of this. He ate his stew. The trip to Crystal Ridge Lake was Arthur's idea. He'd found it on the topographic map, the one on Lucas's wall that he'd been studying since the first week. It was a high lake, 9 miles from the ranch by road, and then a 2-mile trail from the trailhead parking, sitting at 6,000 feet in a natural granite bowl in the mountains east of the valley. In summer, it was a fishing destination. In January, it was frozen solid and inaccessible to anyone without the right gear and the willingness to use it. "I want to see it," Arthur said, at breakfast on a Thursday. "The frozen lake." Lucas looked at him over his coffee cup. "Margaret's never seen a frozen mountain lake," Arthur continued. He said it like it was self-explanatory, like the absence of this experience in his wife's life was an obvious problem that required a specific solution. "It's 9 below, Lucas said. "I know what temperature it is. The trail from the parking area isn't maintained in winter, 2 miles of unbroken snow. You've got snowshoes." Lucas had 3 pairs of snowshoes, which he kept in the barn out of habit from the years when he'd done winter trail maintenance as a side income. He'd used them twice in the last 4 years. "You're not in a condition to do 2 miles in snowshoes at altitude in these temperatures," Lucas said, and kept his voice flat because a flat statement was less confrontational than a concerned one. Arthur looked at him across the table. His expression was even. "No," he said. "Probably not. I'll go as far as I can go and wait somewhere while you take Margaret the rest of the way." Margaret, who had been listening from her position at the stove, said, "I don't need to be taken anywhere." "She doesn't need to be taken anywhere," Arthur agreed. "That's not the point," Lucas said. "Then what's the point?" Arthur set down his coffee. "That I shouldn't try things because they might be too much? That we sit here and wait for a better day that we both know isn't coming?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words had their own weight. "I'm not asking you to carry me up the mountain, Lucas. I'm asking you to come with us to look at a frozen lake." Lucas looked at the table, then at Shadow, who was watching him with the focused patience of an animal that had learned waiting was just another form of work. "I'll drive," Lucas said. They went on a Saturday, when the temperature came up to 4 degrees above zero, which was the best they were going to get. Lucas loaded the truck with the snowshoes, a first aid kit, expanded beyond his usual kit, certain additions he made without commenting on them. Hand warmers, an emergency bivy bag, a thermos of coffee, and a second thermos of Margaret's tea. He also brought a portable pulse oximeter from a medical supply bag he kept under his bed, which he put in his coat pocket without mentioning it. Arthur saw him tuck the kit into the truck bed and said nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes on roads that were plowed but iced in the shaded sections. Lucas drove slow and said little. Margaret sat in the middle and looked out at the landscape with the specific attention of someone who had decided to look at everything, which he'd noticed was a habit of hers. She watched the world like she was committing it to memory, like she was taking inventory against some future need. The trailhead parking area was empty, obviously. A sign indicated the trail was closed for winter. Lucas parked, and they got out into the cold, and the sound of the truck engine fading was replaced immediately by the absolute quiet of a winter mountain, which was a different kind of quiet than the valley. Thinner, older, requiring more of the person standing inside it. "Oh," Margaret said softly. She was looking at the tree line. The firs were loaded with snow that had bonded to the branches in the way that only happened in sustained cold. Not clinging, but architectural, building shapes within the shapes of the trees. Beyond them, the trail rose through a corridor of white and shadow toward a ridge visible against a sky that was the deep opaque blue of high-altitude winter. Arthur was already reaching for his snowshoes. They went slowly. Lucas set the pace from the back, which meant he could watch both of them without making it obvious. Arthur moved well for the first half-mile. His technique was rough, the wide stance of snowshoes unfamiliar to him, but he was deliberate, and he didn't rush, and he used his poles correctly. Margaret, who had grown up in Minnesota and apparently had muscle memory from somewhere, moved better than both of them. At the half-mile mark, Arthur slowed. Not dramatically, just a reduction in pace, a shortening of stride, the breathing becoming visible from farther away than it should have been. Lucas came alongside him without comment. "I'm fine," Arthur said. "I know. I just need to slow down. We've got time." Arthur glanced at him. Then, "You've got that thing in your pocket." Lucas didn't pretend to misunderstand. He produced the pulse oximeter. "Hold still," he said. Arthur held out his finger. The device read. Lucas looked at the number. It was lower than he wanted, but higher than the number where he'd have turned them around. "You're okay," he said. "Keep it slower." What was the number? 89. Arthur processed number. 89. Arthur processed that. What's normal at this altitude? 92 to 95. So I'm low. You're manageable. Different thing. Arthur looked at him for a moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief. It was the expression of a man who had been treating himself as a problem he could manage alone and had just been shown, without drama or condescension, that he didn't have to. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by his ordinary face. "You've done this before," Arthur said. "Field medicine." "Some. More than some, I'd guess." "Keep moving," Lucas said. But they reached the lake at 11:20 in the morning. Arthur made it the full 2 miles, slower than planned, with 2 rest stops, with Lucas reading the oximeter twice more and not liking either reading but keeping that to himself. The last quarter mile was steeper, the trail emerging from the tree corridor onto an open slope that gave out suddenly onto the lake's edge, and it was the kind of view that stopped a person whether they expected it or not. Crystal Ridge Lake in January was a sheet of ice spanning perhaps 40 acres in the granite bowl, surrounded on 3 sides by ridgelines that held the last of the morning shadow. The surface had been swept by wind into a smooth, pale blue-white, and where the ice was thicker it had a greenish tint, and the ridgelines above it caught the sun while the lake itself still lay in partial shadow. And the whole thing sat in total silence under the cold morning sky, like something that had no connection to the world they'd driven through to reach it. Margaret stood at the edge of the lake and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then, "Arthur, look at this." Arthur came to stand beside her. He was breathing hard and he made no effort to conceal it because there was no point, and they both knew it. He looked at the lake, and his face did a complicated thing that Lucas looked away from because it felt private. "Yeah," Arthur said. "Just that." Lucas walked ahead 30 yards and crouched and tested the ice at the edge with the heel of his boot. Solid. He stood and looked back at them. 2 old people in winter gear standing at the edge of a frozen mountain lake in January in Montana having driven an RV across the plains in a blizzard to see things they'd been postponing their entire lives. He thought briefly and without comfort about what he'd been postponing. He pushed it back down. He had a lake to deal with. "It's solid," he called. "Surface is clear. We can go out if you want." Margaret was already walking toward him. They spent an hour at the lake. Lucas made coffee from the thermos, and they stood on the ice 20 yards from shore and drank it, and looked at the ridge lines and the way the sun moved across the snow, and the shadows changed the color of the ice surface from gray-white to blue to something that didn't have a name in the normal spectrum. An eagle crossed the ridge to the north and dropped out of sight into the trees below. The cold was constant and clean and required no defense, just acknowledgement. Arthur sat on a flat rock at the lake's edge after 40 minutes. Lucas checked the oximeter without making a production of it, 87, which was 3 points lower than the trail reading, which was the altitude making itself known. He recorded the number mentally and watched Arthur's color and watched his breathing and said nothing because there was nothing actionable yet, just monitoring, and monitoring without intervention was its own discipline. Margaret had found a section of ice where the transparency went deep, and she was lying flat on her stomach, looking down through it. She'd done this without self-consciousness, just dropped to the ice and pressed her face to the surface, and Arthur watched her do it and laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded. And the sound of it crossed the frozen lake and came back changed, softer, like the lake had absorbed some of the sharpness out of it. "She's been doing that since she was 8 years old," Arthur said, to no one in particular. "Finds a clear patch of ice and has to look through it." "What does she see?" "I've never been able to figure out what she's looking for." He paused. "I should have asked 40 years ago." Lucas looked at the lake. The sun had cleared the eastern ridge now, and the ice surface lit up, and everything that had been shadow and suggestion became specific and bright. He was about to say something, he didn't know what, something without much weight to it, a neutral filler, when shadow moved. The dog had been lying in the snow beside Arthur's rock, calm and settled in the way he got in open terrain when the threat assessment was low and he'd given himself permission to rest. But now he was up, all 4 legs under him in a single motion, weight forward, head high, ears pitched forward at a precise angle. He was oriented toward Arthur. Lucas read it in a fraction of a second, the dog's body language, the angle, the specific quality of the alert, and he was moving before he'd consciously decided to move. Arthur made a sound. Not a word. A short exhalation, compressed, like air being forced out of something that couldn't hold its pressure anymore. His right hand came up toward his chest, found nothing to grip, and dropped. His face went the wrong color, not pale exactly, a grayish pallor that arrived suddenly, like a light dimming under a bad connection. "Arthur, He wasn't. His knees went and Lucas was there, getting under his left arm, taking his weight, easing him backward onto the flat rock rather than letting him go down on the ice. Arthur's full weight came onto Lucas in one concentrated moment, more than you expected from the size of him, dead weight instead of cooperative. And Lucas absorbed it without staggering, planted his feet, and held. "Stay with me," Lucas said. "Look at me." Arthur's eyes were open, but they were finding focus slowly, tracking toward Lucas's face like a compass needle in interference. His breathing was shallow and fast and audible from 6 inches away. "Chest pain?" Lucas said. "Pressure." Arthur's voice was thin. "Center. Not radiating. On a scale. 6. Arms? No. Jaw? Neck? No." Lucas ran the assessment in the clipped, sequential way it had been trained into him. Not panicked, not slow, just the systematic elimination of the worst possibilities first, and the preservation of information for whoever came next. He got the oximeter out. Arthur's finger was cold through the glove, and he stripped the glove and got the reading bare-skinned. 82. That was the number where you stopped watching and started moving. "Margaret." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The lake carried sound, and her name reached her cleanly. She was up off the ice before she turned, and when she saw them, she was already moving. She came fast across the ice without running, which took a specific kind of control, and when she reached them, her face had closed down to essentials. No panic visible, just a focused emptying out, the same quality Lucas had seen in combat medics when the call came in and everything non-essential had to go. "What happened?" she said, flat, operational. Cardiac event. Possibly. Could be vasovagal from the altitude and exertion, but I'm not making that call. Lucas looked at her directly. He needs to go down now. I know. I need you to do something. Tell me. There's a trail marker about a quarter-mile back toward the trailhead. Orange blaze, chest height on a Douglas fir on the left side of the trail, 50 meters past it. There's a secondary trail that branches right. It goes down steeper, but it cuts half a mile off the return, and it comes out at the parking area from the south end. Can you go and mark it for me so I don't lose it with him on my shoulder? She looked at him for 1 second, and in that second, something was communicated that didn't need words. A transfer of information about who he was and what he was doing and whether she should trust it. And she made the decision in under 2 seconds, which was a faster decision-making speed than most people managed under stress. I'll flag it with my scarf, she said. Orange. Easy to see. Go now. Stay on the main trail. She went. Lucas watched her clear the ice margin and enter the tree corridor, and then he turned back to Arthur. Shadow was standing pressed against Arthur's right side, body contact, the heat of the dog transferring through the winter coat. Lucas didn't know if the dog had done it instinctively or if there was something more organized happening, and it didn't matter. The effect was the effect. We're going down, Lucas said. I can walk, Arthur said. I know you can. Let's go. He got Arthur up, arm across his shoulders, hand gripping Arthur's wrist. The weight distributed the way you learn to carry weight over long distances without losing your own center. He'd done it in body armor in the Helmand province heat, and it had been harder then, and the specific muscle memory of it came back in the first 3 steps, and his body found the rhythm. They moved. It was not elegant. Arthur's legs worked, but not reliably. The left buckled twice in the first 100 yards, and Lucas caught him both times without breaking pace, just absorbed the shift and corrected and kept moving. Shadow moved ahead of them on the trail, periodically looking back, checking spacing and pace, which was his patrol behavior, and which Lucas found steadying in a way he didn't examine. Margaret's scarf was visible from 40 meters, orange wool tied at eye level on the fur she'd found, exactly where he'd described. Lucas hit the secondary trail at a controlled jog, which meant Arthur had to keep up or be dragged, and Arthur kept up, jaw set, legs working by will more than function. The descent was steep enough that Lucas had to brace every 3rd step to keep them from gaining speed they couldn't control. His quads burned by the halfway point, and the cold was in his lungs with every breath, and he could feel Arthur's pulse through the wrist he was gripping. Too fast, irregular, but present and consistent, which was the only information that mattered. They cleared the tree line. The parking area was visible below. His truck, white roof in the sun, the only vehicle. Margaret was already there. Already had the rear door open, already had her coat off and folded on the seat for padding. She'd gotten there before them by running the main trail once she'd flagged the secondary, which was a calculation she'd made without being asked. Lucas got Arthur into the rear seat, reclined, coat under his head. He got the first aid kit and pulled the aspirin. Low dose, and he looked at Arthur. Are you on blood thinners? Warfarin, 250. Then no aspirin. He put it away. Your nitro. Do you have it? Arthur's hand went to his coat's inner pocket. The reflex was automatic, which meant he always knew where it was. He produced a small spray bottle. 1 dose, Lucas said. Arthur administered it himself. Lucas watched his face. Margaret was in the front passenger seat turned backward, watching the same face, her hand on Arthur's ankle, because it was the part of him she could reach. Talk to me, Lucas said. Pressure. Coming down. Arthur's voice was still thin but clearer. 5. 4.5. Breathing? Better. I'm getting you to the hospital. I know, Arthur said. No argument. No argument. Lucas got in the truck. He started it, pulled out of the parking area, and put it on the road going down the mountain. He drove fast where the road was clear and measured where it wasn't, and he didn't speak, and Margaret didn't speak, and Arthur lay in the back with his eyes open watching the sky through the rear window, and Shadow sat on the floor of the back seat with his head on the seat beside Arthur's hip. The mountain fell away beneath them. Redstone Valley Regional Medical Center was a small facility. 6 beds in the emergency department, no cardiac catheterization capability on site. Serious cases transferred to the larger hospital 40 miles north. Lucas knew this because he'd researched it 6 days after Arthur told him the diagnosis, not because he'd expected to need it, but because he was built the way he was built. He pulled into the ambulance bay, which was technically not for private vehicles, and got out and didn't move the truck. They took Arthur on a gurney in under 2 minutes. Lucas parked the truck. He came back and found Margaret in a waiting room chair, a hard plastic chair, orange, the universal color of institutional waiting, with her hands in her lap and her face doing the thing it had been doing since the ice, which was holding itself in a specific configuration that took effort. She was holding it very well. He sat down 2 chairs away. They waited. A doctor came out at the 90-minute mark, young, female, with the practiced composure of an emergency physician who had delivered bad news enough times to have developed a method. She told them Arthur had experienced an acute cardiac event, likely exacerbated by altitude and cold and physical stress, that he was stabilized, that they were recommending transfer to the facility north for further evaluation and monitoring, that he was alert and talking and had specifically asked her to tell his wife that he was, in his words, not done yet. Margaret's face shifted for about 3 seconds. Then it settled. "Can I see him?" she said. "In a few minutes. We're just getting him ready for transport." The doctor went back through the doors. Lucas looked at the floor. Margaret looked at the door. "You knew what to do," she said. "Some of it. All of it." She paused. "The trail. The aspirin question. The nitroglycerin. A beat. You knew exactly what to do." Lucas didn't say anything. "How many times have you done something like that?" she said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. He thought about it honestly. "Enough times that it stopped feeling like something I was doing and started feeling like just, what happens next?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the door. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm going to anyway." "I know." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor between his boots. "He's going to want to keep going on the trip." "Yes." "After this." "I know. He will." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. "And I'm going to let him, because the alternative is watching him sit still and wait, and that'll kill him faster than any lake." The waiting room was quiet. Somewhere behind the door, something beeped, steadily and without urgency, which was the sound of machines doing what machines were supposed to do. "Margaret," Lucas said. She looked at him. "He told me he never asked you what you see when you look through the ice." Her expression changed. Not dramatically, a small shift, but real. She looked at the door and then at her hands. "Light," she said, "coming from underneath. It looks like there's something lit up down there, even when there isn't. Even in the dead of winter with the sun above you, if the ice is clear enough, it looks like the light is coming up from the dark." She paused. "I've been looking at it since I was a child, and I still don't completely understand why it looks that way." Lucas looked at the floor. "That's a good thing to look for," he said. She didn't answer, but her hands, which had been folded still in her lap, unclenched, and she let them rest open on her knees, which was the smallest possible movement and which was everything. The door opened. A nurse appeared. "Mrs. Collins? You can come back now." Margaret stood. She smoothed her coat. She walked to the door with the careful steadiness of a woman who had decided some years ago that certain kinds of falling apart were a luxury she couldn't afford, and who had kept that decision every day since. Lucas stayed in the orange chair. Shadow lay down across his feet. The waiting room held them both in its fluorescent quiet, and outside the windows the Montana afternoon was doing what Montana afternoons did in January, going dark early, going cold fast, the mountains turning from blue to black against a sky that faded from pale gold to nothing in the space of 20 minutes. Arthur was alive. Lucas sat with that fact and let it be what it was, without adding to it or qualifying it, and for a man who had spent 15 years adding weight to every fact he touched, that restraint cost him something. He paid it. He drove back to the ranch alone. Margaret stayed at the hospital. They'd given her a room in the small family suite on the second floor, a concession the facility made for transfers that would take time to arrange. Arthur was stable, monitored, waiting for the cardiology team from the northern facility to decide whether transport was necessary tonight or could wait until morning. The decision had nothing to do with Lucas, and there was nothing useful he could do in an orange plastic chair, so he told Margaret he was going home to feed the horses and would be back in the morning, and she'd nodded and said drive careful on the ice, and that was the whole of it. The road back was dark by 5 o'clock. He drove with the high beams on and shadow in the passenger seat, and the truck's heater worked at the cold that had settled into the cab from 3 hours of sitting in a hospital parking lot. The mountains were invisible against the sky now, just a black edge where the stars stopped. He fed the horses. He checked the barn, the wood stove, the pipes. He did these things with the mechanical completeness of a man running a checklist he didn't need to think about, because his mind was somewhere else and had been since he sat in that waiting room and watched Montana go dark through the window. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. The house was wrong without them in it. Not dramatically wrong, not loud in its emptiness, not grief-shaped. Just off, the way a room was off when furniture had been moved, and the arrangement hadn't settled into ordinary yet. He'd lived alone in this house for 7 years and had been comfortable with the silence. And somewhere in 6 weeks, the silence had changed character without asking his permission. He drank his coffee. Then he got up, went to his bedroom, and stood in front of the closet. He opened it. The box was on the top shelf where it had been for 7 years, where he'd put it the day he moved in and had not touched since. A standard moving box, sealed with tape, his own handwriting on the side in black marker. R. Foster. Personal. Not his handwriting style now. His handwriting from 15 years ago, which was slightly different, less controlled, made by hands that hadn't yet learned certain things. He got the box down, set it on the bed, sat beside it. He didn't open it immediately. He sat with it the way you sat with something before a decision, acknowledging its weight before you committed to whatever came next. Arthur's voice came back to him without invitation. The way Arthur's voice had been coming back to him for weeks now, at angles he didn't expect, carrying things he hadn't asked for. A promise isn't worthless just because you're late. He'd said it 3 days ago, in the kitchen, not directed at Lucas. It had been part of a longer conversation about Arthur's daughter in Portland and a disagreement they'd had years ago that had taken too long to repair. A passing remark, not intended as anything more than that. Arthur had no idea what it landed on. Lucas opened the box. Oh, Ryan Foster had been his closest friend in the Marines. That was the simple version, the kind you could say out loud without it costing you something. The longer version was that Ryan had been the person Lucas measured himself against, the standard he used to calibrate what a good Marine, a good man, a good friend actually looked like in practice. They'd gone through infantry school together, deployed together twice, and the shorthand they'd developed over 8 years was the kind that eliminated whole paragraphs of explanation. A look across a room that conveyed threat assessment and plan simultaneously. A silence that communicated more than most people got from full sentences. Ryan had been killed in Helmand Province in 2009, during a route clearance operation that went wrong in the specific way those operations went wrong. Not catastrophically, not with warning, just a pressure plate in a culvert at the wrong moment, and then a radio call that Lucas took from 40 meters away, and which he could still hear if he let himself. He didn't let himself often. What was in the box? Ryan's watch, which Lucas had carried out. Ryan's last letter home, which had never been mailed. 3 photographs. A folded map of a hiking route in Colorado that Ryan had been planning for the summer that didn't happen. And a card, a birthday card, still sealed, addressed to Ryan's daughter Claire in Ryan's handwriting, with a note clipped to it that said, "If I don't make it back, give this to her when she's old enough." Claire Foster had been 4 years old in 2009. She was 19 now. Lucas had called Ryan's wife, Dana, twice in the first year after Ryan died. Both calls had been short and painful in the specific way. Calls were painful when both people were carrying grief and didn't know what to do with the other person's. Dana had been in Ohio at that point, living with her parents. She'd been kind to him, which made it worse somehow because he'd spent those 2 calls understanding that she'd needed something from him that he didn't know how to give and had driven away from instead. He hadn't called again. 15 years of not calling was its own kind of weight. He'd gotten used to carrying it, integrated it into the architecture of his daily life the way you integrated an old injury, worked around it, stopped noticing it except in specific weather. He picked up the sealed birthday card. Claire would be 19 now. The card had been sealed and addressed by her father when she was 4, and whatever Ryan had written inside it was 15 years old and from a dead man to a daughter who was now almost an adult. He set it down. He picked up his phone. He sat there with his phone in his hand for 11 minutes. He knew because he was watching the clock on the microwave visible through the bedroom door, using it the way you used a fixed point when you were trying to stay oriented. Then he opened his contacts, found the number he'd entered and never deleted in 15 years of telling himself he would call, and dialed. It rang 4 times. He was preparing himself for voicemail when it picked up. "Hello?" A woman's voice. Cautious, the way people answered unknown numbers now. "Dana," he said. "It's Lucas Grant." Silence. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4, but full. "Lucas." Her voice changed. Not anger, not what he'd braced for. Something more complicated. "It's been a long time." "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't start with sorry," she said. "Just, where are you?" "Montana, I have a ranch out here." "I heard you'd gone somewhere rural." A pause. "How are you?" He stopped. The automatic answer was fine, which was the answer he gave everyone about everything, but he was sitting on his bed with his dead best friend's box open beside him, having just gotten back from a hospital where an old man he'd known for 6 weeks was being monitored for cardiac events, and fine was not accurate. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's more honest." She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I know that version." "How are you?" he said. "We're in Tennessee now. Moved 4 years ago. I remarried. His name is David. He's a good man." She said it directly, not apologetically, and he respected that. "Claire's at University of Tennessee, 2nd year. She's studying environmental science." Ryan would have had a lot to say about that. Dana laughed. A short, involuntary sound, surprised out of her. He would have had endless opinions about it, yes. The laugh broke something open slightly. Not fully, just enough. "I have some things of his," Lucas said. "I should have gotten them to you a long time ago. I've been—" He stopped again. I was not going to say the word afraid, but it sat in the sentence's gap, and they both heard its shape. "I didn't know how to do it. That's the honest answer." "I know," she said. Quiet. Not absolution, just acknowledgement. "There's a birthday card," he said. He wrote it for Claire. It's still sealed. The silence this time was different, longer and more textured, the kind where someone was doing something private that you waited for. When Dana spoke again, her voice had changed register. "She's asked about you," she said. "Both of us have. I told her you were someone her father loved, and that sometimes grief makes things hard to do. She understood that. She's a good kid." Lucas pressed the heel of his free hand against his sternum. It wasn't a gesture he made consciously. It was just what his body did when something hit in the right place. "Can I come see you?" he said. Another pause. Then, "Yes, Lucas, you can come see us." He left on a Tuesday, 12 days later. He'd spent those 12 days finishing the critical ranch maintenance, arranging for Edna Casper 6 miles east to check the horses every other day. She'd agreed without hesitation, and with a complete absence of curiosity about why he was leaving, that he found deeply characteristic and deeply appreciated. He'd also spent 3 of those evenings at the hospital, where Arthur had been transferred and then transferred back, stabilized again, declared well enough to be discharged with a modified medication regimen, and a cardiologist's instructions that Arthur received with polite attention and then mostly ignored in spirit while technically complying with the letter. He'd told Arthur about the phone call the night before he left. Not everything, not the box, not the weight of 15 years, not the sealed card and what it meant. Just the basic frame. A promise to a Marine brother who'd died, a family he hadn't contacted, a phone call that had finally happened. Arthur had listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Lucas finished, Arthur looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, "What took you?" Not an observation in the form of a question. "I didn't know what I'd find when I got there," Lucas said. "Anger. Maybe, or worse, pity, or them being fine without me, which somehow seemed worse." Arthur nodded slowly. He understood that one. "And now?" "Now I know they're fine, and I know they'd still like to see me." Lucas looked at the table. "Which means I've been staying away to protect myself, not them. I convinced myself it was the other way around for 15 years. Arthur didn't say anything for a moment. "A promise isn't worthless just because you're late," he said. It came out quietly, like he was saying it to himself as much as to Lucas, which was maybe the point. Lucas looked at him. "I said that to Claire last month," Arthur said. "On the phone. About something completely different." A pause. "Funny how things find where they need to go." Lucas picked up his cup. I'm leaving Tuesday. Good, Arthur said. And then, take the dog. Long drives are better with a dog. I know that. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. What? He drove southeast through Wyoming and into Colorado before picking up the interstate south. He drove the way he did most things, without urgency but without stopping unnecessarily, covering distance steadily. Shadow rode in this passenger seat the first day and migrated to the back seat by the second, stretching out with his head on the armrest in the specific self-satisfied way of a dog who had figured out the best arrangement. The landscape changed as he went south and east. The high plains opened up, immense and horizontal, the kind of terrain that made you aware of the sky in a different way. Not the hemmed-in sky of the mountains, but something vast and slightly unnerving in its completeness. He'd driven across this country twice before, both times in a hurry, both times with the destination mattering more than the ground between. This time he let the ground between be what it was. He called Arthur twice from the road. The calls were short. Arthur reported ranch conditions. He and Margaret had gone back to the ranch, feeling like the least appropriate house guests in history for just abandoning it, Margaret's words. Edna Casper had already found her way into the kitchen and made chili, which nobody had asked for, and which was apparently excellent. How are you feeling? Lucas said, the second call. Like a man who's been told to take it easy and who doesn't fully know how to do that. Margaret? She's watching me like I'm a pressure gauge on a boiler. Good. It's not always pleasant. Good, Lucas said again. Arthur made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. How far? Day and a half, maybe 2. Drive safe. Always. That's a lie. Drive safer than you usually do. Lucas looked at the road. Yeah, he said. All right. Tennessee in February was nothing like Montana. He crossed the state line in early afternoon and the air changed almost immediately. Heavier, softer. Not warm, but not the dry cold of the West. The trees had a different skeleton. The hills different proportions. Everything lower and denser and in subtler colors, as if the landscape had decided on understatement as a design principle. Dana Foster lived in a suburb of Knoxville, in a house with a covered porch and a yard that had the organized look of someone who gardened seriously. He sat in his truck in front of the house for 2 minutes with the engine off. Shadow put his nose on the back of his neck from the rear seat. Yeah, Lucas said. I know. He got out. Dana answered before he reached the porch. She must have heard the truck. She was shorter than he remembered, or he'd remembered her taller, which was a thing that happened with people you'd built up in your own head over years of absence. She was in her mid-50s, brown-haired, with the kind of face that had taken the years and worked with them instead of against them. She looked at him from the porch for a moment and then came down the steps. She hugged him. He wasn't prepared for it. His arms came up half a second late, the delay visible, but he held it when it came. You look tired, she said, pulling back. Long drive. Come in. Is that your dog? Shadow had come to stand beside Lucas, reading the situation. That's Shadow. He's been through worse. He can come in too. Claire came home from campus at 4 o'clock. She was 19 in the way that certain 19-year-olds were, already past the soft uncertainty of it, already carrying herself with a quiet self-possession that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with having thought seriously about who she was. She had Ryan's jaw and Ryan's eyes, which was the first thing Lucas registered, and it went through him like a cold wire. She stopped when she saw him. Dana said, Claire, this is Lucas Grant. He served with your dad. Claire looked at him, not hostilely, just directly, the way young people looked at things they'd been told were significant and were now forming their own assessment of. Mom told me you might come eventually, she said. I should have come sooner, he said. Yeah. She set her backpack down. But you're here now. It was so precisely Ryan's syntax, the acknowledgement of the failure, the immediate movement past it, that Lucas had to look at the wall for a second. They sat at Dana's kitchen table and Lucas put the box between them and opened it and told them what each thing was. He told it as straight as he could, not performing grief, not managing distance, just saying the true things in order. The watch, the letter, the photographs, the Colorado hiking map with Ryan's handwriting marking the route in red pen, elevation notes in the margins. Dana held the photographs and looked at them without speaking. Claire held the hiking map. She turned it over, read the elevation notes, put her finger on the route her father had planned for a summer that never happened. He was going to do this? She said. He talked about it for 2 years, was going to take leave in August. He talked about hiking. I didn't know about a specific trip. She looked at the map. I used to think all his hiking talk was just talk. No, he had specific places. He had a list. She folded the map along its original creases and held it in both hands. Can I keep this? All of it's yours. That's why I brought it. Then Lucas reached into the box and picked up the sealed card and set it in front of Claire. She looked at it. Her name in her father's handwriting, slightly unsteady printing. The handwriting of a man not used to writing with particular care, trying to do it carefully. She picked it up. She turned it over. She looked at the back where it was sealed. He wrote this when I was 4, Lucas said. She nodded. She was pressing the edge of the card between her thumb and forefinger, not opening it, just holding it, feeling the physical fact of it. I'll read it later, she said. Quiet. Certain. Okay, Lucas said. Dana reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's hand, and Claire didn't pull away, just turned her hand over and held on, and Lucas looked at the empty box and the things that had been in it for 15 years and felt something in his chest that had been load-bearing for a very long time begin, carefully, to shift. It didn't disappear. He wasn't naive enough to expect that. But it moved. It changed its angle, became something slightly different in its relationship to the rest of him. And the difference was that it no longer faced outward like a wall, but inward like something he could finally put down when he was ready. He stayed 3 days. They looked at photographs Dana had, hundreds, on her phone and in albums, Ryan in every stage before Helmand, laughing in most of them. Lucas contributed the details behind the ones from the deployment years that Dana hadn't been there for, and he told them honestly, without sanitizing and without dwelling on the worst of it. Claire asked good questions. She'd clearly been thinking about her father for 19 years, assembling him from pieces, and now she had someone who'd been present for the missing chapters, and she used the access carefully. Were you with him when it happened? She asked, on the second evening. Not right there, Lucas said. I was 40 meters back. I heard it. Did he... She stopped, reframed. Was it fast? Yes. He looked at her. That part's true. That's not something I'm saying to make it easier. She nodded. She seemed to be deciding something. Then, do you think he knew how much we... She stopped again. He talked about you both every day, Lucas said. Not sentimentally, just you were in his thinking all the time, where you were, what you were doing, what you were going to do. It was constant. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she exhaled and looked at the ceiling and back down. Okay, she said. Okay, Lucas said. He left on a Friday morning, early. Dana came out to the truck while he was loading his bag. The air was damp and gray, not cold by Montana standards. A thin February fog sitting in the yard. Shadow was already in the passenger seat. You could have come sooner, Dana said. Not accusatory, just honest, completing the ledger. I know. It would have been hard, she said, but it would have been good. I know that too. She looked at him directly. Don't wait another 15 years for the next hard thing. He looked at the truck, then at her. I've been trying to figure out how to do that. How's it going? He thought about Arthur in a hospital bed, and Margaret with her hands flat on a kitchen table, and a frozen lake, and a dog who'd stood beside an old man to keep him warm. Better, he said. Recently. She nodded. She stepped back from the truck. Come back when you can. Claire will want to show you what she does with that map. He thought about Ryan's handwriting marking elevation in the margins. 19 years old, sitting with that map. Tell her I'll come back, he said. Tell her yourself, Dana said. You've got a phone. He got in the truck. He started it. He backed out of the driveway and drove to the end of the street and turned north, and the fog swallowed the house behind him, and he drove for a while without music and without the radio, with only the sound of the engine and Shadow's breathing and the wet road under the tires. After 20 miles, he reached up and put his hand on the dog's head for a moment. Not petting, just contact, just the fact of another living thing within reach. And then put it back on the wheel. He drove north. The weight in his chest was different now, still there, but different. Lighter in the specific way that things became lighter when you stopped carrying them alone and let other people's hands touch the edges of them. Not taking the weight, just sharing the fact of it, which turned out to matter more than he'd allowed himself to believe. Montana was 2 days ahead. The ranch. The horses. Whatever was left of the winter. He put on the heater and drove into the gray February morning, and for the first time since he'd left the military, the future in front of him felt longer than the past behind him. Not by much, but enough. He crossed back into Montana on a Sunday. The state line came up on the interstate without ceremony. A green sign, a change in road surface, the sky doing something different with the light the way it always did west of the Dakotas. Shadow picked his head up from the back seat when the altitude started climbing, some internal barometer registering the shift, and Lucas cracked the window 2 inches and let the cold air move through the cab. He called Margaret from a gas station outside Billings while the truck took fuel. "We're back," Margaret said before he said anything. She'd seen the Montana area code. "How did it go?" "It went." He leaned against the truck. The wind was coming out of the northwest, cold and direct. Better than I expected, harder than I was ready for, both at the same time. "That's how those things usually go." "Yeah." He watched a semi pull through the lot. "How's Arthur?" "Arguing with the cardiologist's instructions, which means he feels better." "Tell him to follow the instructions." "I've been telling him that. He listens to you more than he listens to me." "That can't be true." "It's annoying, but it's true." A pause. "Come home, Lucas. The horses miss you. Edna Casper has been in the kitchen every other day, and she's reorganizing things that don't need reorganizing." He got back in the truck. Home. The word had landed in her sentence without announcement, and he'd taken it in without correction, which told him something about how things had reorganized themselves while he wasn't watching. He drove the last 4 hours in the dark. Spring came to Redstone Valley. The way it always did, not as a single event but as a campaign, advancing and retreating, winning ground in the south-facing slopes and losing it back to late snow on the ridgelines. The temperature swinging 15 degrees between afternoon and midnight for weeks before it finally committed. The creek at the east edge of Lucas's property broke up in early March, the ice going in sheets one afternoon with a sound like distant rifle fire, and the horses went fractious for 2 days after, from the noise and the smell of moving water, and the particular seasonal excitement that animals felt when the world changed states. Arthur watched the creek break up from the fence line with an expression that Lucas had learned to read over the winter. Present tense, fully inhabited, the look of a man squeezing the juice out of every specific moment because he understood with biochemical clarity that the number of moments was finite. "That sound," Arthur said. "Happens every year," Lucas said. "I know, but I've never heard it." He watched the ice sheets rotate slowly in the current before the creek carried them around the bend. "I've seen spring come in Iowa 100 times. It doesn't do that." "Flat country," Lucas said. "Flat country," Arthur agreed. "Everything's different when there's elevation." Cora was at the fence beside them, her nose over the top rail, watching the creek with the same focused attention she gave most things she didn't trust. She'd tolerated Arthur's presence at the fence for the last month without threatening him, which, for Cora, was the equivalent of a formal friendship declaration. Arthur reached out slowly and put his hand on her neck. She moved her ear. She didn't pull away. "She likes you," Lucas said. "Don't tell her I said that. She'll get difficult." "All the best ones do," Arthur said. The RV was repaired in April. A mechanic from town had come out in February at Lucas's request, a slow leak in the fuel system that had contributed to the engine dying on that December highway. And the part had taken 6 weeks to source, and the installation had happened on a Thursday afternoon while Arthur watched and offered engineering commentary that the mechanic, a 26-year-old named Brett, who had grown up in the valley, received with the patient tolerance of someone who knew the customer was right even when he wasn't. Lucas had paid for the repair. Arthur had argued. The argument lasted 11 minutes and ended when Lucas said flatly, "It broke on my road. I'll cover it," and walked back to the barn, which closed the discussion. The RV sat repaired and ready on the gravel apron through March and into April, and nobody mentioned it, and Lucas didn't ask about their departure plans, and Arthur and Margaret didn't announce them. The not mentioning was a mutual thing, managed by all 3 of them, which meant all three of them knew the departure was coming and were making a shared decision about how much space to give it. It was Margaret who finally said it, on a Tuesday evening in mid-April, while she was washing the dinner dishes and Lucas was drying them. A division of labor they'd arrived at sometime in January and which had never been formally agreed upon. "We're going to leave Saturday," she said. She said it to the window above the sink, the way she sometimes said things that had weight, not avoiding the room, but giving herself a moment's buffer before the words were fully in it. Lucas dried a bowl. "Okay. We've been here almost 5 months. I know. We've stayed too long." "You haven't," he said. He said it simply, not performing generosity. "You haven't stayed too long." She turned from the window and looked at him. Her expression was the one he'd seen at the hospital in January, the controlled version, but with the control loosened slightly. "This was supposed to be one night." "It was," he said. "Then it was something else." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the dishes. "Arthur wants to take the coastal route down through Washington and Oregon," she said. "Then down to Big Sur. We're behind schedule by about 4 months." "You don't have a schedule." "We have a list." "That's different." "Yes," she said. "It is." She rinsed a glass and handed it to him. "He wants to see the Pacific Ocean, Lucas. We've lived our whole lives in the middle of this country, and neither of us has ever seen the Pacific Ocean." He dried the glass. He thought about Ryan's Colorado hiking map with the red-marked route and the elevation notes in the margins. He thought about Claire's hands on it. "You'll see it," he said. "I know we will," she said. And she said it with a certainty that wasn't bravado, just the settled conviction of someone who had decided a thing would happen and had organized herself around that decision. Friday night, Lucas made dinner. Not because it was his turn or anyone's turn, just because it was the last dinner, and cooking was the thing he could do with his hands that meant something without having to say anything. He made the short ribs he'd been saving since January, low and slow in the Dutch oven, with the red wine Margaret had brought in from the RV back in December, and which had been sitting on the counter waiting for an occasion that kept not arriving. He made roasted potatoes and the last of the winter carrots from the root cellar. The kitchen filled with the particular warm density of a meal that took time, and the three of them moved around each other in the kitchen without collision, Margaret making a simple salad, Arthur sitting at the table with a glass of the wine, narrating his opinions about cooking methodology to no one in particular while doing nothing to help, which was his consistent position. "You're supposed to sear it first," Arthur said. "I did sear it an hour ago." "I didn't see that." "Because you were in the barn talking to Cora. She had opinions about the weather." "She always has opinions about the weather," Lucas said. "She's wrong about half of them." "Still more conversation than most people offer." Arthur swirled his wine. "What's the wine?" "Whatever Margaret brought." "It's a Côte d'Aron," Margaret said from the salad. "We picked it up in Missoula in November. We were planning to open it on New Year's." "We were in a hospital in December," Arthur said. "I know where we were, Arthur." "I'm just accounting for why we didn't—" "I know, Arthur." Arthur looked at Lucas. "She does that," he said. "2 words and the conversation is over." "I've noticed," Lucas said. "It's very efficient," Arthur said. "It is," Margaret agreed. They ate at 7. Shadow stationed himself under the table with the focused discipline of a dog who had decided that proximity was its own reward regardless of outcome. The dinner was good, not perfect. One of the potatoes had gone too far on the bottom, and the carrots needed salt. But good in the way that mattered, which was that it tasted like something made with intention, in a specific place by people who had been through a winter together and were sitting at the tail end of it. Nobody made a speech. Arthur told a story about a road trip he and Margaret had taken in 1987 in a car with no air conditioning through central Texas in July, which had apparently been a formative experience in their marriage for reasons neither of them fully agreed on. Margaret's version and Arthur's version of the same trip were substantially different in their details, and they corrected each other periodically with the practiced ease of two people who had been telling parallel versions of the same stories for decades. Lucas listened and said little and finished his wine. After dinner, he washed the dishes alone. Margaret had gone to the RV to start organizing for the morning. Arthur sat at the table with his glass and watched Lucas work the way he'd watched Lucas work all winter. Not supervising, just present, keeping company in the way some people were good at. "You're different than you were in December," Arthur said. Lucas ran water over a pan. Am I? December, you would have had us in the barn. Lucas looked at the window. The yard was dark beyond it, the barn light on automatically. Probably, he said. What changed? Lucas dried the pan. He thought about it honestly, because Arthur had earned honest answers. I stopped being so careful about what I let in, he said. Or I'm trying to. It's not finished. It won't be, Arthur said. That part doesn't finish. I'm figuring that out. Good. Arthur finished his wine, set the glass down. You're going to be all right, Lucas. Lucas looked at him. Arthur's face in the kitchen light was older than the face he'd first seen through an RV window in a December blizzard. Not dramatically, but the winter had put something additional in it, some extra mile. His eyes were steady and clear. So are you, Lucas said. Arthur held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked at his empty glass. We'll see, he said. Not with bitterness, just with accuracy. They left at 8 in the morning. Lucas helped Arthur run the final checks on the RV, engine oil, tire pressure, the fuel system connection that Brett had repaired. He did it systematically and without rushing, and Arthur stood beside him with the quiet patience of a man who understood that this was Lucas's way of doing the thing he couldn't say. Margaret came from the house with a container of food, the leftover short ribs, some bread, things for the road, and set them in the RV's refrigerator. She came back out and stood in the yard. Shadow was sitting beside her. He'd followed her out from the house and taken up his position at her left side and was looking at the driveway with the expression he got when he understood something was ending but hadn't yet decided what to do about it. He can come, Arthur said. He was looking at the dog. We've got room. He can't come, Lucas said. He'd miss the horses. The horses don't like him. They tolerate him. It's a relationship. Lucas closed the engine hood. He'd miss them anyway. Arthur looked at Shadow for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Margaret crouched down, carefully, at her age, with the deliberateness of someone who'd learned not to move too fast in that direction, and put both hands on Shadow's face. The dog led her. She said something to him that Lucas couldn't hear, quiet and complete, and Shadow's ears went soft and his tail moved in one slow arc. She stood up. She looked at Lucas. She didn't hug him. She put her hand on his forearm for a moment, just the flat of her palm, a second's pressure, and then took it away. Feed yourself properly, she said. I do. You don't always. I've seen the refrigerator. It's a working ranch. It's an excuse. She looked at him steadily. Invite people over. When it gets hard in the winter, call someone. Don't just... She stopped. She looked at the mountains behind the house. Don't just manage it alone. He held her gaze. I won't, he said. She looked at him a beat longer, making sure the answer was real and not just polite. Then she seemed satisfied. Arthur had come around the side of the RV. He put out his hand. Lucas took it, and Arthur gripped it with both of his. The covering grip, both hands, which was a different statement than a handshake. Thank you for the fence work, Lucas said, and the hydraulic line, and the circuit breaker. Thank you for the gate, Arthur said. They looked at each other. There was no adequate way to account for a winter in a sentence, which meant they didn't try. Drive safe, Lucas said. Drive slower than I want to, Arthur said. That's the instruction I've been given. Follow it. Some of it. He let go of Lucas's hand. He turned to the RV, and his movement was the same careful, measured movement it had been since December. Managing, parceling, the cost of each step kept below the threshold of visible. He climbed the entry steps with one hand on the rail. The RV started. Lucas stood in the yard with Shadow beside him. The vehicle moved through the gate, down the track, and reached the highway. The left turn signal came on. Then it pulled out and moved west, and Lucas watched it until it cleared the rise in the road and dropped below the crest and was gone. Shadow made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, something quieter and less defined than either of those. Then he turned and went back to the barn, because Cora was making noise in the south stall, and some things waited on feelings. Lucas stood in the empty yard. He stood there for about a minute. Then he went to work. The months that followed were different in ways he was building vocabulary for. He fixed the north fence properly in May. New posts, new wire, the way it should have been done in January instead of the weather emergency version. He bred the mares in the spring and had a foal by August, a colt that Cora was predictably aggressive about, and Bell was predictably indifferent to, and he named him without overthinking it. He called him Dietz, for the handler who'd left Shadow behind, which felt like the right weight for a name. He called Dana Foster twice. He called Claire once, and she talked for 40 minutes about her fieldwork in the Smoky Mountains, and Ryan was everywhere in the way she talked about elevation and watersheds and the specific patience required by environmental science. And Lucas listened and said little and found, somewhere in the middle of it, that the weight that had reorganized itself in February had continued reorganizing. Not dissolving, he had no illusions about that, but finding a different place to live in him, one that didn't block the view in every direction. He called Edna Casper and asked if she wanted to bring her grandkids out to see the new foal. She showed up the next day with 3 grandchildren between the ages of 6 and 11, and they spent 2 hours in the barn, and the youngest one fell asleep on a hay bale with Shadow lying next to her. And Lucas stood in the barn door and watched this happen and didn't move for a while. He called a veterans organization in Billings and told them he had space. That had been Margaret's comment the week before she left, offhand, in the kitchen, almost to herself. This place has more room than one person needs. You should think about what to do with the extra. He dismissed it at the time, or told himself he had. But it had been working in him ever since, the way things worked in him, slowly, below the surface, until they arrived at the condition of obvious. The organization sent him a pamphlet. He read it over 3 evenings and made some calls and had a conversation with a caseworker named Torres, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and now coordinated transitional housing and support programming for veterans leaving the service with no clear landing point. Lucas described the property, described what he could reasonably offer: 2 spare bedrooms, working space, horses, isolation that was either a problem or an advantage, depending on the person. Torres was quiet for a moment after the description. "We have a list," Torres said. "I figured you might," Lucas said. The first veteran arrived in September. His name was Marcus Webb, 28, Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, recently separated, carrying the specific variety of quiet that Lucas recognized because he'd worn it himself for years. Marcus showed up with a duffel bag and a handshake and very few words, and Shadow read him in 30 seconds, and then walked alongside him to the spare room and sat outside the door while he unpacked, which was the dog's own form of welcome, and which Marcus seemed to understand without explanation. Lucas showed him the barn, the horses, the fence line, the tools. He told him how the wood stove worked and where the spare propane was and what the weather did in October. He asked Marcus if he'd worked with horses before. Marcus said no. Lucas said that was fine. He didn't tell Marcus his own history. He didn't perform recovery or model healing or offer the kind of structured guidance that felt like a program. He just ran the ranch the way he ran it and made room for another person in the running of it, and that was the full extent of what he offered, which turned out to be exactly enough. Margaret called in October. He was in the barn when his phone went, and he answered with hay on his hands, and Belle making opinions about something at the back of the south stall. "We're in Maine," Margaret said. He hadn't expected Maine. "I thought you were doing the coast." "We did the coast. We saw the Pacific Ocean in August. Then Arthur said he wanted to see both coasts, which wasn't on the list, but Arthur. A pause. He heard wind in the background. "He's sitting on a rock right now looking at the Atlantic. He looks very pleased with himself." "How is he?" The pause before her answer was brief but specific. "He's having a good day," she said. "He's been having more bad days than good lately, but today is a good one. He wanted to feel the Atlantic wind." Another pause. "We thought we'd drive down to Virginia in November, then maybe west again. We don't have a plan after that." "You never had a plan?" "No," she said. "We didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "Lucas, he wanted me to tell you something." "Okay." He said to tell you that the broken RV was the best thing that happened on this trip." Lucas looked at the hay on his hands. Belle had gone quiet. "He talks about you," Margaret said. "Both of you, you and Shadow. He says you were the part of the trip we didn't know we needed." Lucas pressed his back against the barn wall. The wood was solid and cold and specific. "Tell him the fence still holds," he said. "I will." A pause. "He'll like that." "Tell him the tractor's running right, no leaks." "I'll tell him." Her voice had something in it that he didn't try to name. Take care of yourself, Lucas. Working on it, he said. I know. A beat. That's enough. The call came from a Maryland area code in late November. He didn't recognize the number and almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Some instinct, the same category of instinct that had made him go out into a December blizzard to check on headlights. Lucas, Margaret's voice. Different. Thinner. He set down what he was holding. He went this morning, she said. Peacefully. In the room. He didn't wake up. Lucas stood in the kitchen. The wood stove was going. Shadow was at his feet and had gone still. Are you alone? He said. The hospital staff are here. They're very kind. Her voice was controlled the way it had been controlled all year, but underneath the control was something vast that the control could no longer fully contain. I'm all right. I just needed to tell someone who knew him. I'm coming, Lucas said. Lucas, you don't have to. I'm coming, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay. He told Marcus what had happened. Marcus nodded and said he'd handle the horses and the barn. Lucas drove to Billings, flew to Baltimore, and was in Maryland by midnight. He took a cab to the hospital and found Margaret in a family waiting room with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking. She stood when she saw him. She looked at him for 1 second and then she let the control down, fully, all at once, and he held her while she went through it. Not completely, not for long. Margaret was built for short earthquakes and long recoveries. And when she was done, she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat back down. He sat beside her. He wasn't in pain, she said. Good. He'd had a good day yesterday. We walked along the harbor. She looked at the wall. He said the light on the water looked like something out of a painting. He said he finally understood why people painted harbor scenes. A pause. I told him people painted harbor scenes because they were beautiful, and that wasn't a mystery. He said it was different seeing it yourself. She stopped. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things, Lucas said. Not everything. She looked at her tea. He was wrong about the aspirin. He took it twice when he wasn't supposed to. I know. He told you? I guessed. She looked at him. Something crossed her face that was almost a smile. He thought he was being subtle. He wasn't. No. She looked at the wall again. He never was. They sat in the Maryland hospital room until almost 3 in the morning, and Lucas said little and Margaret talked when she needed to and went quiet when she needed that, and he stayed present through all of it without trying to fix it or route around it, which was the only thing you could do and the thing that was hardest to learn. He flew back to Montana 4 days later. Margaret drove the RV west. Not immediately, she had paperwork and arrangements, the logistics of a death, in a state you don't live in. But she sent him a message 2 weeks later that said simply, heading home eventually. Not sure where home is yet. He wrote back, the South Room's still yours if you need it. She didn't respond for 3 days. Then, I'll let you know. He got the package in January. A year, almost exactly, since the blizzard. A padded envelope, Margaret's handwriting, Maryland postmark. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook, the kind sold at drugstores, plain blue cover, slightly swollen from use. A sticky note on the front in Arthur's handwriting, trip log, A&M Collins. He opened it at the kitchen table. Arthur had been keeping a travel journal. Not daily. The entries were irregular, sometimes 3 in a week, sometimes 10 days between. His handwriting was the careful printing of an engineer who'd spent decades writing equipment notes, clear and slightly mechanical. He described roads, towns, weather, meals. He described the Pacific Ocean in 2 paragraphs that were exact and specific, the kind of description that came from standing there and looking for a long time and then trying to be faithful to what you saw. He described the ranch. The entry was dated December, the December of the blizzard, the night of the gates. Lucas read it once and then read it again. Stuck on a highway in a Montana storm. No way forward. Knocked on a gate and a man came out in the dark and didn't have to help us but did. His name is Lucas. He has a dog named Shadow who seems to know things. The house was warm. Margaret made tea in someone else's kitchen like she always does. I don't know why I'm writing about this as if it's significant. It's just a man who helped us in a storm. But it felt like something, It felt like the kind of thing you miss the meaning of if you're not paying attention. And then, in a different ink, written later, Lucas could tell by the slight difference in the pen's quality, a single line added beneath. It was the meaning. We just didn't know it yet. Lucas sat with the notebook for a long time. The wood stove ticked. Shadow lay under the table. Outside, the valley was white and still under a clear winter sky. The mountains blew beyond it, everything in its place. He closed the notebook. He got up and went to the barn. Dietz was in the north stall now, 8 months old, testing the limits of everything the way young horses did, opinionated and quick. Cora was next to him, still not fully at peace with his existence, but tolerating it with the resigned dignity of a senior employee dealing with a new hire. Belle was in the back corner being philosophical. Marcus was there, carrying water, moving with a steadiness that hadn't been there in September. He'd started talking more in October, which was how Lucas knew things were settling. Not about the big things, those came slowly, if they came, but about the daily ones, the horses, the weather, the fence line, the equipment, the ordinary language of a working day, which was its own kind of recovery. Cold front coming, Marcus said. Tonight, Lucas said. We'll need to check the south water line before dark. Already on it. Lucas looked at Dietz. The colt looked back with the blunt confidence of an animal that had decided the world was generally in order. He put a hand on the colt's neck and felt the warmth of him, the specific living warmth of a large animal in a cold barn, and stayed there a moment. Marcus, he said. Yeah. There's a veterans organization in Billings that needs host ranches. I told Torres we might be able to take a second person in the spring. Marcus considered this. We'd need to expand the east stall. I know. And fix the guest bathroom properly, not the patch job. I know. I can do the stall if you do the bathroom, Marcus said. Deal, Lucas said. They went to check the water line before the cold front hit. The ranch that had been one man's fortress became something less fortified and more durable over the years that followed. Veterans came and went, some for weeks, some for months. One man named Garrett, who came for a summer and stayed 2 years and left only when he had somewhere specific to go, which was the best reason to leave. Margaret came back the following April, driving the RV alone, parking it in its spot on the gravel apron like it had never left, staying for 6 weeks and reorganizing the kitchen twice, and talking to Shadow every evening until he came to sit beside her without being called. She visited every spring after that. Lucas drove to Tennessee twice in 2 years. Claire showed him the hiking map on his second visit. She'd had it framed, the original, Ryan's red-marked route, and the elevation notes in the margins, and it hung on the wall of her apartment near the window where the light hit it in the afternoon. She was 21 by then, finishing her degree, talking about fieldwork in the Pacific Northwest. She looked more like Ryan every year in ways that no longer went through Lucas like a wire, but simply settled into their proper place, which was love without the damage attached to it. He called Dana on Ryan's birthday each year. The first call was 12 minutes. The second was 45. By the third, they'd stopped marking it as Ryan's birthday specifically and started just calling each other on that day because it was their day now, the day they'd collectively decided to keep. Shadow grayed around his muzzle in his second year at the ranch, and slowed at the ends of his perimeter walks and took longer to get up in the mornings, but he was still there, still positioned at the center of every room with multiple people in it, still watching with the trained attention that had never fully retired, still reading the character of newcomers in the first 60 seconds, and rendering a verdict that Lucas had learned not to override. The south room stayed available. The gate stayed unlocked at night. Not always. Not out of naivety, not without judgment. There were nights he locked it, and reasons he had for those nights. But the default shifted. The starting position changed. After a December blizzard and a borrowed winter and a travel journal, in a blue spiral cover, the man who had built his life around controlled distance found that the distance, when released, didn't destroy him. It turned out the opposite was true. There is a kind of courage that nobody talks about because it doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't wear body armor or carry equipment or announce itself in any recognizable way. It looks like unlocking a gate in the dark. It looks like sitting in a kitchen with strangers and letting the silence be what it is. It looks like picking up a phone after 15 years and saying only, I should have called sooner, but I'm calling now. Most of the journeys that change us don't begin when we decide to go. They begin when something breaks down at our gate, Some inconvenience, some intrusion, some person or circumstance we didn't ask for and weren't prepared to receive, and we make the small, difficult choice to open the door instead of wait for it to pass. Arthur Collins drove a broken RV into a Montana blizzard and got stuck in a ditch and knocked on a gate in the dark. He died 11 months later with both oceans behind him and no conversation left unfinished. Lucas Grant stood at a window at 2 in the morning and watched an old man take his medication alone in the snow, and understood without being told that something serious was parked outside his gate. He opened the door anyway. That's the whole story. That's all it ever is. Someone needed the door opened, and someone opened it. Whatever you've been postponing, the call you haven't made, the person you haven't visited, the door you've kept locked because it's easier than what comes after. This is the